On today's episode of Locked On Wild, as we start to look at what went wrong this season, we start with secondary scoring. Where did it go?
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day. And we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, Jay Homuth joins us to talk about the secondary scoring drought for the Minnesota Wild this season. We'll take a look at how they compare in the Central Division to the teams that scored a ton of goals. And we'll look at what needs to happen for the Wild to fix that issue going into next season. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. As mentioned, Jay Homuth joins us, one of the regular cast of characters here at Locked On Wild. Jay, postseason hockey is upon us. Watching all the teams that made it. We've got games on as we are recording here for this episode, and glad to have you back on the show. How are things going, man?
Things are going pretty good. Happy to be back on. It gets a little hard when I'm out here in Virginia, but anytime I can get back on is it's a great time. And yeah, like you said, we got games going on. I know you're watching Dallas and Vegas, and I'm watching LA and Edmonton right now. So just really wishing that Minnesota was able to get in there this year, but probably would have been for the worst if they snuck in this year. It wouldn't have been enjoyable to watch.
Yeah, it would have been. It would have very much been like pulling teeth without any anesthesia. So we are just going to try to figure out what went wrong and how to fix what went wrong. And it's pretty easy, honestly, to point at the things that went wrong because we watched the team all season. We saw them play out over and over. And we're going to start with, I think, one of the biggest issues for this team, as we will talk about statistically here tonight. Secondary scoring, Jay, just it dried up, and we saw as the season wore on, the Wild just had a tougher and tougher time. Once they went to the Kaprizov, Boldy, Eriksson-Ek combination as their top line, the rest of the lineup really struggled to provide complementary scoring there, and it was just a pretty easy plan of attack for opponents. If you can stop the Kaprizov line, you stand a good chance to stop the Wild. Secondary scoring was non-existent down the stretch.
Yeah, it was bad. I remember I saw a couple tweets in early March saying that the scoring line for Minnesota will be whoever is with Kaprizov. You just got to put two players with Kaprizov, and that'll take care of it for the night. But there was too many games this year. I forgot the number of games it was. I had it in my notes, but a lot this year. The Minnesota Wild only scored one goal a game.
Yeah,
got shut out a lot this year. It's very uncharacteristic. Normally, it's the Wild doing that with their defensive style of shutdown play, but that's also when we had depth scoring. I remember a couple of years back, I think we had 8 or 9 skaters getting to double-digit goals with 7 and 20 plus. That was nowhere to be found this year, and it was really frustrating to watch, especially some of the players that have been doing good in the past had really off years too. That's another thing that went wrong. You look at Zuccarello, though his numbers are decent, I think he only had 12 goals this year. He a lot of giveaways, really bad year for him controlling the puck. Johansson and Gaudreau, nowhere to be seen. Cardio Kings every single night. It it wasn't the Minnesota Wild they were used to watching. Even when they have a down year, even when they have down years, it was like almost like they were just barely in that playoff spot. They could still compete, but this year it just wasn't it was a one-line team, and that's not how you win in the NHL.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the stats from 2021, 2022, the goal explosion, 310 goals on the season. The Wild that season had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players with 20 or more goals. They then had 7, 8, 9. They had 10 players with 10 or more goals. They had one player with 9. So depth scoring, balanced scoring. You've got Kaprizov that led the way with 41. You had Fiala, you had Hartman, you had Zuccarello. You had scoring up and down the lineup. You had Freddie Gaudreau chipping in 14 goals. Marcus Foligno with 23 goals. But
wow.
you look at what happened this year, and those numbers all dropped. The Wild ended up with 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's not a huge drop. They had 5 players with 20 or more goals this year. But beyond that, then you had 6, 7, 8, 9. You had 9 guys with 10 or more goals. Connor Dewar got traded. Marcus Foligno missed a large portion of the end of the season. And Kaprizov, Boldy, Eriksson Ek as your top line. As you mentioned, Zuccarello went from 22 goals to 12. Ryan Hartman did increase his goals from 15 to 21, but then Marcus Johansson collectively had 19 last year. He finished with 11 this year. Freddie Gaudreau went from 19 to 5. Like they're just were guys that were completely non-existent. And the thing that I think was frustrating like the most was that second line wing spot all season. Like you got Marco Rossi anchoring that line, 21 goals for him. You have Matt Zuccarello, a playmaker on the other side. And you had Marcus Johansson, who was basically tasked with just skating around the ice and I guess trying to get open like a corner 3 shooter for an NBA team, but then he would never shoot. Like he just was taking up a spot without providing you any sort of positive impact. And that, honestly, that really hampered that line. And that was a big reason, I think, is just because like that would have been a perfect spot for somebody who was going to rip 5 or 6 shots a night. And that you got 42 games of 1 or fewer, 43 games of 1 or fewer shots from that spot in the lineup. That's unacceptable.
Yeah, and I think that also hindered Zuccarello's play too, because if you go back to when Matt Zuccarello started his career and when he was playing with the Rangers, he's never been one to really control the puck in the offensive zone. He really likes to get the puck off his stick, set people up. He uses the long stick to really throw defenders off. And when Johansson's just skating around, not really finding spots, it leaves Zuccarello and Rossi's crashing the net. Now you got Zuccarello trying to make a play, and that's never been his play style. So that's another reason why he was giving all these giveaways. And I think it set Zuccarello this year at a disadvantage, which set the Wild at a disadvantage because you need your vet to be able to produce. And Rossi still had a great year, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Somehow surviving on that line. So I don't know. He's got a bright future if he stays with Minnesota. That's a talk for probably a couple more future podcasts. But yeah, I don't know. Like we needed a shooter in that spot. So like we were talking about before the show, I think Josef Cramarosa is a great person to slot in there. That's a joke, by the way. I don't want anyone to get all mad at that.
It's so funny because
likes to shoot though.
Like I was looking for today's random game of the day, which by the way, new bit. If you missed it on our social media channels, we're going to be going through the archives and recapping a random Wild game every day through the offseason. And for today's, Josef Cramarosa was on the roster. And I vaguely remember the Joseph Cramrosa experience. But what I will say is, compared to Marcus Johansson, at least he'll let it rip. At least he would shoot.
Every chance he gets, he's shooting the puck.
So we'll talk about. I'm going to extrapolate what Liam Ogren did at the end of this season, because honestly, I think I've got an idea for how to fix that spot in the lineup. But what I'm going to do first, I crunch the numbers, and I've got to look at what each line for the Minnesota Wild did this year compared to the rest of the Central Division. So we'll take a look line by line and see how the Wild stack up amongst the rest of the division. That is on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Game Time. It is getting nicer and nicer out, and if you are a fan of the Minnesota Twins, opportunities coming up to head to Target Field and watch a game in the great Minnesota spring weather outdoors. You've got that. You got the Minnesota Timberwolves in action against the Phoenix Suns, and you may decide spontaneously, hey, I want to go catch a game. If you've ever had a spontaneous desire to go watch a game in person, you know the hassle that can come from buying tickets the day of. And Game Time is here to take all of those hassles, throw them in the garbage, so you can just enjoy the experience. Game Time offers you last-minute ticket deals, plus panoramic seat views. You will see everything from what you will be able to look at from your seat in the arena. Game Time also has their lowest price guarantee. If you find tickets that are cheaper, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Seth Topal joined by Jay Homuth. Jay, let's talk about some of the numbers here for the Central Division statistically. Went and crunched it. Would it surprise you that by line, first line, second line, third line, fourth line, would it surprise you that by line, the Minnesota Wild had the second most? Actually, no, I take that back. They had the most goals from their top line in the entire division.
I don't think it would surprise me because I know how hot they were at the end of the year. But the only line that I believe would have that trumped would be the O'Reilly, Forsberg, and Nyquist line, if there was one.
So the top line trio of Kaprizov, Boldy, and Eriksson Ek, 105 goals between the three of them. That now, I will say I am taking line combinations off of daily faceoff. So the numbers fluctuate a tad.
Yeah.
But Kaprizov, Boldy, Eriksson Ek, they combined for 105 goals this season. Second in the division was Colorado's top line with 98. Nashville was next with 97. Then it was Dallas with 86 and Winnipeg with 81. So that's like that doesn't surprise us. That tracks because that line combination was great. All of those, not all those goals came as a line combination, but that's what those three players had for points this year. They had 124 assists, which was fourth in the division behind Colorado, who had 156. Most of that was McKinnon. Then Nashville had 141. Dallas had 126 and the Wild had 124. Here's where the disparity starts to come in. Second line, the Minnesota Wild had 34 goals from their second line. Now, this is the final combination that included Rossi, Zuccarello, and Liam Ugrin. If you put Marcus Johansson back in that spot, then you get yourself up to 43.
Yeah, it was only 10 more, I think.
But here's the problem. St. Louis's second line had 84 goals. Winnipeg's second line had 84 goals. Dallas's second line had 72 goals. Colorado's second line had 62 goals. You are way behind the pace for the rest of the teams of the division.
Is that Winnipeg line Appleton, Lowry, and Niederreiter?
I believe so. Let me just see what they had again.
I think that's the best scoring checking line in the entire NHL.
So this actually for a second line had Ehlers, Monahan, and Toffoli. So they had Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton
third line, second line.
As their third line.
How many goals did they have?
Here's the third line disparity. The Wild's third line had 33 goals. And again, that's if you put Marcus Johansson on that line. Ryan Hartman, though, had 21 of those 33.
Not okay.
So that's not great. Winnipeg had 44 goals from their third line. Get this. Dallas had 59 goals from their third line.
They got the rookies on that line, though.
Yeah, they had Tyler Johnston with 32 of those.
Jeez.
And then fourth line. Nashville led the division with 31 fourth line goals. Then it was Dallas with 28. Winnipeg with 25. Colorado with 23. The Wild had 10.
Ew. Oh, that's so bad. Like, just looking at numbers anytime you get a chance, you'd expect a player on the fourth line to have at least 10 goals in a season. Just one of the players on the fourth line.
Yeah.
Cough, Brandon Duhan. Cough, Connor Dewar. But, we don't get the luxury of having them anymore because of what we did this year. But, yeah, that's not good. 10 goals between your whole fourth line for an 82-game season.
No, and like to peel this back a little further, like the thing that's frustrating about these line numbers is so line 2, I mentioned 34 goals. Even if you put Johansson on that and you say you've got 40 out of those two, out of that trio, Marco Rossi had 21 of that. Third line, 33 goals. Ryan Hartman had 21 of that. So, like, you've got one guy that is eating basically the entire production of your second, your third, and then your fourth line is just non-existent. Like, if you needed any indication as to just how dry the secondary scoring was for the Minnesota Wild this year, that's it. Like, what did they finish with goals for the season? What do we have here? 248 and 105 of that from your top 3 players. So that leaves you 143 goals for the rest of your 20-ish players, minus the 2 goalies, 18.
And Hartman and Rossi had 42 or 43 of those. Yeah,
so that's yeah, so you got 100 goals for like 12 players, 13 players. That's just not. That's not what we would call.
I think Brock Faber had more goals than Gaudreau, Lettieri, Lucchini, obviously Ustinov, but I like the way Ustinov played. I don't think we really expected him to be. I think we expected him to be more of a replacement for Dewar.
Yeah.
Like, to really fill in on that fourth line. I don't expect him to score 20 goals a year. I expect him to just be a really good. I mean, he could. I think he could. I think he could get up 15, secondary scoring. I mean, that's the reason why we're watching Vegas play Dallas and not us. So
yeah, that's really what it comes down to, is just, and look at how some of these games have played out. Vancouver got the 2 goals from Dakota Joshua to win game 1 of that series. 2 goals from a secondary scorer. Toronto,
Boston game 1. I think Boston had I think the Brusque had 2 of the 5 goals, but who had the rest of them? I think right away it was a 4th line. Even Toronto in game 1, 4th line goal. I think Evangelista had a goal for Nashville last night. You need depth scoring, especially if you make it to the playoffs.
Yeah, you just have to have other options to be able to step up when those top line guys are facing all of the attention that they are. I've got some ideas for how to fix this, what to do, including simply taking what Liam Ugrin did in his 3 games this year. If you extrapolate that to a full season, the results may surprise you. So we'll talk about that and more as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. We are in NBA and NHL playoff mode, plus Major League Baseball is in full swing as well. And FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So all you got to do, Minnesota Twins are playing the Chicago White Sox. Chicago is awful. So throw down on the Minnesota Twins. If the Twins win, you win. If the Twins lose, you win. It's that easy. So just head to FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Today's episode of Locked on Wild also brought to you by Policygenius, the world of life insurance, and trying to find the perfect policy for you and your family can be very daunting. Best of all, Policygenius is here to help make the process a little simpler. Policygenius helps you compare your options from top companies, and their team of licensed experts is on hand to help talk you through it. You can talk to a team of award-winning agents who will walk you through the process step by step. Your work life insurance policy may not offer enough protection for your family's needs. Even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. Check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policygenius. Head to policygenius.com/lockedonnhl or click on the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/lockedonnhl. policygenius.com/lockedonnhl. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Seth Topol joined by Jay Homuth. And Jay, let's talk about this, because there are 2 ways I think that this situation could be fixed. Either, well, depending on what happens with Danila Yurov. If he comes,
I was going to say, he's that slot for the second line.
If he comes to the States, give him that spot. If he doesn't, you got to either go Liam Ugrin or probably Ryan Hartman, because here, let me just hit you with some things, because I think we agree that shooter is probably the most pressing need for that spot in the lineup. Ryan Hartman had the same number of shots this year as Matt Zuccarello, 173. that was tied for 4th on the team in shots. Liam Öhgren had in his 4 games, he had 8 shots on net. He averaged 2 shots per game. If you take 82 games times 2, it's 164 shots. Guess where that would land? That would be 6th on the team, just behind Marco Rossi. If he did just 2 shots per game. If you do 3 shots per game, 82 times 3, that's 246. That gets you up to 3rd on the team behind Kirill Kaprizov and Joel Eriksson Ek. Let's try 2.5. That gets you to 205. That puts you 4th on the team behind Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Matt Boldy. It's not a high bar to set, but it just underscores how important that spot in the lineup is and why that spot needs to employ a shooter.
Yeah.
Like, that's
100%.
as simple as it is.
And yeah, you just said it. I'd be like, you did it. And I don't really got much to say. You can't, because Zuccarello's the passer.
Yep.
And Rossi's the finisher. You need a shooter on that line, and it can't be someone who's just out there skating around. And I really like what Öhgren did. I liked his shot. He hit the post against San Jose, I think, right after he scored his first goal. You could tell he's got a great shot. But again, if Yurov can make his way over to the States this offseason, that's his spot, in my opinion. After watching him play 2 years over in the KHL, I think that's the answer right there. Unless we go my route and we trade Gustafsson, you get rid of Gaudreau, you get rid of Johansson, you free up some cap space, you go sign a good right-hand shot to fill in that line. You let the young guys all play together in the bottom 6. You embrace the fact that you're probably not going to make the playoffs next year, which is okay. It's okay. Kaprizov's not going to leave if we don't make the playoffs 2 years in a row.
Unless here's the caveat on that, because I listened to Judd's hockey show the other day, and I actually I was impressed at the length at which Judd was going to really flesh out like what needs to happen to make sure that Kaprizov doesn't just get annoyed by this whole thing. It's one thing to not make the playoffs. It is a bad route to go to not make the playoffs and to basically just spin your wheels. Like, no progress towards the future. If the Wild get some younger players into the lineup this year and they you can say okay, Öhgren is in the lineup. He's a staple. We got Danila Yurov here. He is at his floor right now as a second line guy with the potential for him to hop up to that top line. If Kirill sees some of that stuff and sees that those guys can play, that's the selling point. That's what pulls him back in, is seeing that next wave and knowing that those guys are capable. Because guess what? If those guys aren't, if those guys underperform, if those guys don't live up to the expectations that have been put on them, that's when he leaves.
Yeah, he's gone. And I do think it helps, too, the fact that we have a good fistful of Russian prospects like Firstov, Husnudinov, and Yurov. All the Ovs. I saw someone on Twitter reply to me on that. But those 3 being on the roster in general boosts his morale. That makes him want to stay. And if they can perform up to the standards that they're placed on, and if Yurov can be a mainstay on that power play with Boldy, Kaprizov, Favor, and Eriksson Ek or Yakimachuk, again, we'll talk about that in June, then that's what tells Kaprizov, this team is going to be great. And I'm sure there's people that are in the organization that are telling him, listen, he knows about the dead cap. He knows that they can't go out and get someone to play alongside him. But Minnesota Wild fans also have to remember that the dead cap is coming. But the problem with having so many really good young prospects is that we're going to have to pay those really good young prospects. So it's not like we can just go out and get Leon Draisaitl. You can't forget about Brock Faber, who's going to get paid this offseason. And you can't forget about what we're going to have to re-sign Kaprizov to, because it's going to be more than what he's getting right now. And it's we locked up Boldy pretty cheap, but who's going to say
it's going to be 12?
Yeah.
12.
Who's going to say Yurov doesn't come over, play 2 years on his entry-level deal, have a 30-goal season, and then boom, we got to give him $7 million. So it's going to be. It's not like we can just go out and it's going to solve all the problems. So, and Wallstedt, what's going to happen with Wallstedt? If he ends up being one of the league's best goalies, you got to pay him like that. So it's going to be it's not going to be what a lot of people are thinking it's going to be, but it's a great position to be in that we have this much young talent. And the young talent is what can keep the people like Kaprizov here.
Yes, that is 100% it. And that's why it is imperative that you get those guys into positions to make sure that they are capable of playing bigger roles over the next few seasons. So that's, I think, a good route to go to fix the secondary scoring is to just stop putting guys in positions that they can't succeed in. Let them step to the backgrounds. Like if you go into the season next year with Marcus Johansson not on the roster, with Freddie Gaudreau as like your fourth line center, and you can employ a third line that has like Marcus Foligno, Murat Huznadinov, and Ryan Hartman, all of a sudden, that is where the depth scoring starts to come back in.
I also cannot forget to mention Riley Heidt. I'm sorry, I forgot him. He is going to be a major point producer on this team. That's a gut feeling I got. He could work his way up to that first power play for sure. It's just, who do you take off? Because again, do you want to run 5 forwards on a power play, or do you want to put Faber back out there? Riley Height's going to get paid eventually with the Minnesota Wild. But this is what happens to good teams, though, is at some point in the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to have to say goodbye to a really good player like we did Kevin Fiala. It's going to happen a lot. That's what every good team in the NHL has to deal with every 2 or 3 years, because you just can't afford them anymore. But you have a massive capital in point producers on your team, so that's good.
Yeah, that's depth scoring. You know, it doesn't take much, but all of a sudden some guys filling key spots, all of a sudden it can turn around in a hurry. So that's the hope, is that depth scoring with youth and with more skill and more talent can become a strength as opposed to a glaring weakness. So we'll see how that plays out. We have a lot more to get to here throughout the rest of the week and just looking at where it went wrong this year. So appreciate you joining us, Jay. We'll get you back on, because it sounds like you'll be in the state of hockey here for a few weeks. So we'll definitely get you back on. But listeners, make sure to hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. New episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you for the next one here at Locked On Wild.